Welcome to another episode of the Basalon Cycling Podcast. I'm your host Sherry. Before we jump into the episode, make sure to rate the show if you're listening on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and to like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. It really helps to support the channel. Let me know in the comments which topics would you like to hear in the podcast. Leave a comment below. Today is all about hydration, fueling, caffeine, and more. How do you tackle a 791 kilometers ultra race in the desert? Well, to help me answer all these questions is Emily Arrell from the sports science team of Precision Fuel and Hydration. Welcome to the show, Emily.
Lovely to be on. Thanks for having me.
So you are part of the sports science team at Precision Fuel and Hydration, right?
Yeah, one of the sports science team. There's a few of us now, actually. Quite a lot of our team, our sports scientists, come from that background.
That's great. Actually, I've been using some of the products during my races, and they've been game changer. So that's the topic of today's podcast. We're gonna discuss fuel strategies, nutrition, caffeine intake, and more. So let's start. For example, I think there's a lot of talk about how to fuel and hydration for maybe events up to 48 hours. But for example, I do long distance ultra races, so it's sometimes days. How would you plan a strategy for it, and what things would you consider?
It's a big question, and I think there's lots to consider. And I think if you look online, there's a lot of different messaging. There's contradicting views. You could find people saying, do hardly anything, like drink nothing, drink loads. Like there's a real range in terms of fuel and hydration advice out there. I think in terms of what we do at Precision Fuel and Hydration is just try and simplify it for people and try to help with the education side of things and make it as simple as possible. When we're talking about any kind of events, cycling specific and longer duration, some moderate, some shorter, like the main three, we call them levers, that are important in your fuel and hydration strategy are the carbohydrates for fueling. That's the main fuel source that you'll burn to keep yourself moving. So that's like the gels, the drink mix, the real foods as well. When we're talking about these longer ones, we can talk about the different formats. And then the hydration, the other two levers being fluid to replace your sweat kind of volume losses, and then sodium, which is the main electrolyte you lose in your sweat. So as long as you're getting those in, we can talk about in terms of like what quantities and are right for you and the event that you're doing, then you should be fine. It should help with kind of optimal performance. That's the goal, right?
Yeah, exactly. I feel like hydration and electrolytes is something people really underestimate. I did it myself. I didn't have any like hydration strategy for races, and I had issues with edema, dehydration, headaches. So I've been using actually the Precision Fuel hydration calculator online, and
Nice.
there's things I didn't even thought about, like a kind of like carbo loading, but on electrolytes. Like, you recommend that to take electrolytes the night before. Why is that?
Yeah, it's like a blanket recommendation across the board, that one for us, what we term kind of preloading. But lots of people think before an event, especially a long one, especially a hot one, that you just need to kind of drink a bit more to start hydrated, and they just kind of drink a bit more plain water. And you kind of do the opposite. So you flush yourself out and you can start dehydrated, so on the back foot. So instead of that, preloading, so drinking a strong electrolyte concentration, for us, our recommendation is pH 1500 ahead of an event, roughly one the night before and also in the morning of, so about 2 hours before you go and do your event. It just does the opposite. So that sodium helps you retain the fluid a bit better and you start well hydrated. Like you would with like carb loading, where you're having good carb meals beforehand. It just means that you get to that start line with your carb-rich breakfast well fueled and all your fuel stores topped up. It's the same but for hydration. So it means you're on that start line well topped up in terms of like your fluid and your plasma volume levels, and that means you're ready to start sweating because your kind of reservoir is topped up, ready to go.
Exactly. And for example, I know you work with a lot of athletes, and you have access to a lot of data. What do you think it would be like an optimal strategy? Or, I mean, I know everybody is different, and there's something like called like the sweat rate. So it's different for every individual. But what would be the strategy? For example, I'm doing Badlands. Is a race in the desert in Spain, like around, normally it's around 40 degrees, and it's very long. Like unless you are in the fast group, it takes you more than 48 hours. So what would be your recommendation? Also, water can be scarce at times.
Yeah, that's a crazy event. I have to say, best of luck. We do have an athlete, one of
Thanks.
our athletes called Danny Shrewsbury racing this year at Badlands as well. So look out for her. It's a tricky one because, like you said,
Nice.
it is really individual in terms of like the volume that you should be drinking and then what you should be drinking. So what sodium concentration that should be. They're the main kind of two questions that come to mind. Like, oh, I get lots of people when I'm talking about all kinds of events be like, oh, how much fluid should I drink per hour? Well, it really depends on the event and on your individual losses. One thing I would say is when you're putting your strategy together then and thinking about how much fluid you should be drinking, obviously the logistics play a big part in a race like Badlands. So it is about kind of filling up when you can and making sure that you've got the capacity to carry enough fluid with you. And when you're actually putting the strategy together of then how much should I drink, it is important, like you said, to be aware of your sweat rate and your sweat losses. I know that the temperatures can get obviously very high at Badlands, so it's important that you know how high can your sweat rate get then, for example, because it is different from person to person. So what you can do is you can measure your sweat rate in a range of conditions. I always advise this to my athletes, but if you weigh yourself before and after some of your training sessions, you can get a really good idea of how much you lose, and you'd want to build up a bit of a database on that. So how much do you lose at race intensity that you're going to go race at in Badlands in those hot conditions? What is the highest your sweat rate is going to be out there? So you've got an idea in the back of your head of the amount you'll be losing. And then also, obviously, Badlands is such a long one that there'll be some really cooler points in the night where you'll be sweating much less. But what does that look like for you? Is that 500 mil an hour? Is that half? Is that still quite high? Like, just get an idea of some of these numbers, and then you can plan the kind of fluid quantities that you need to take and carry and that you need to then consume, right? And obviously, you don't need to replace 100% of your losses. But when we're talking about these, I have to call them like super long races, right? Over 48 hours is crazy long. It's about making sure that you're reducing this kind of, you're accumulating this deficit if you're not drinking enough to match your losses. And when you're going for this period of time, you really don't want to build up this deficit early on or at any point that's going to impact your performance and your ability to keep riding, right? So it's important that you are proactive with your fluid strategy, especially at times when it's hotter. You're aware that it's hotter. You're aware, okay, my sweat rate it's pushing up. I feel like I'm losing a lot more. I need to be more proactive with the volume that I'm drinking. And if you've got that data in the back of your head, that really helps to know in terms of the bottles, how many are you having, how many you need to make sure that when you get to the next point where you can fill up, you are filling up, you've drank enough. You can be a bit more kind of aware of the quantities instead of just like building up this deficit. And once you get too far into that deficit, it's really hard to catch up by the time you're feeling like extremely thirsty and just a bit down.
Yeah, exactly. And for example, as you work with many athletes, have you noticed any gender differences? For example, there has been some discussion in ultra cycling. There's been some studies when they made a survey between female athletes that tend to struggle with edema, and is related with their drinking strategy, use of painkillers, caffeine, and electrolytes. Have you noticed that? Because actually, I did the transcontinental race, and I did the same race the year before. And the year before, I didn't take electrolytes. I forgot after the first day, to be honest. And I got like a really bad edema, and in my hands, in my face, not only at the end, also during the race, especially when it got really warm in the Balkans. And this year, I took it religiously. Like every time I went to sleep, I had some of the 1500 ones,
Nice.
the tablets, and then I had the sachets during the day. And this time I didn't have edema in my hands or in my feet, and it was also quite warm. Have you seen this with any other of your athletes?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's two sides to it. First being kind of the male and female split. I think in terms of hydration side of things, it's more on an individual basis than the difference between male and female kind of genetic side of things, especially the sweat sodium. It is really individual. It's predominantly genetically determined. So you see people losing as low as 200 milligrams per litre up to 2,000 milligrams per litre of sodium, right? So you could be anywhere on that range. And that is different from person to person. So it's not different. I wouldn't be able to kind of, there's not a trend between male and female in terms of those losses. Sweat rate, there's a few different factors that influence it. So it's intensity, it's your clothing, it's the conditions being a massive factor, right? So what the temperature is, the humidity, and also body size a bit. So if you did have, with sweat rate, you could have a really large male compared to a really small female. There'll be a difference in their kind of sweat rate, would be the only difference. But in terms of everyone's strategy, it's not too different. When we have a huge database of kind of, this is what that I run at Precision, all of kind of people's intakes, examples of what people actually drink during races and the sodium in that. And there isn't a huge trend and difference between male and females. It's more on an individual basis, the volume that they're drinking, the concentration that they're taking on to match their individual sweat sodium losses, right? Instead of kind of a huge difference. What I would say is, I think you've come to the conclusion well with figuring out what went wrong for you, where you had issues kind of day 2 and 3 where you dropped the sodium, right? It was likely that you were just, by just drinking plain water, especially at these kind of long events, and it'll be important to consider at Badlands, if you are just drinking kind of plain water or very diluted concentration of electrolytes, then you are going to flush yourself out a bit, and you're going to kind of build up and flush yourself out. You're not going to be replacing the sodium that you are losing in your sweat, which helps with fluid retention. It's really important in your performance. So therefore, it's important that, one, you're consistent with it, but two, you're replacing your sodium losses to match the individual losses, right? So it'd be good. There's different ways to do this, but you can get a sweat test to determine how much sodium you lose in your sweat, and that's a good way to know. And then you can match it. So, for example, for myself, I lose just over 1,000 milligrams per liter in terms of the sodium per liter of sweat. So I know when I'm drinking, when I'm exercising, I replace it at that concentration to make sure it's right for me.
Yeah, exactly. And for example, also the water retention, not only in relation to electrolytes, but also like with carbs. Like when you consume so many carbs, it binds water. So actually, it's kind of like you have to keep a balance there with all the carbohydrates you have, what you drink, etc. And in terms of like now you have this really cool like race strategy fueling stickers and things like that. It's quite cool to kind of remind yourself for races, kind of eat, because it's something you forget in these long races. I have a Garmin alert that tells me every 30 minutes I have to eat, because otherwise it could be hours, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I haven't eaten anything for like 2 hours because you go sometimes so slow. What do you see? I mean, now you mentioned one of your athletes is doing Badlands. What is more or less the outline of what someone will have as a carb intake every hour for a race like this? I mean, it's individual, of course, but some people can tolerate more or less. But there tends to be like some discussion about like 60, 90 grams per hour.
Yeah, so with carbohydrate targets, it depends on the duration and intensity of a race to know whether they should be aiming for kind of 60, 75, 90. But you're absolutely right. People have different tolerance to carbohydrates, and you can train your gut to absorb more carbohydrates, especially over certain durations, right? So for Danny, who's racing, she's going to aim for about 60, I'd say. But the most important thing with fueling, like you said, and like you said about not going kind of 2-3 hours and forgetting to fuel, is about, for Badlands where it's such a long duration, that you're consistent with it. So setting kind of reminders is perfect, but making sure that you're being consistent with the fuel. And how she's doing it is quite interesting, because again, like I said, you can train your gut to absorb more carbohydrates, more fuel. You can get used to this duration taking on that quantity, and also the types of products that you're using. So she's predominantly using sports nutrition products, gels, and she's using lots of chews and bars as well. I think bars are kind of a popular one for this duration. It's a great way to make sure you're getting a good amount of carbohydrates. Obviously, as I said, the main fuel source that you're burning, aiming to hit kind of towards that 60 grams per hour. But that goal might not be for everyone if people can't tolerate that amount. It is about training and building up what you can tolerate. And there's something called kind of gut training, a protocol, where the science recommends about an 8 to 10 week period of building up how much you can tolerate. So at the moment, if I was working with an athlete building towards an event, if they can tolerate 20, 30 grams per hour, it's about building that up week on week in kind of your race intensity sessions and practicing this strategy. And with all of the recommendations and numbers that we're kind of chatting through, it is about practicing, implementing them, building it up. And on the carbohydrate side of things, it's about training your gut and getting used to it. But obviously, Badlands is such a long one. So it's about you're going to incorporate lots of different methods to hit that carb goals, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. It's very interesting that you talk about gut training. People always ask me, I mean, I can tolerate very well carbohydrates. Like I can eat like 3 bags of Haribo in an hour or like with no stomach issues or like two gels, like the 90 grams and then have another 30-gram one. And but I didn't know. I mean, I ate a lot of candies all my life, and I think that's why I can tolerate it. And now it's kind of I'm used to these levels of like consuming that amount of sugar. But I think many people struggle, have a stomach GI issues, so a lot of them ask me what can I do to avoid that. I think yeah, as you said, you have to take it progressively and train your gut like you do your muscles to be able to handle this amount of carbs, and also the intensity. I feel sometimes people, your pacing strategy is very important, not to like overdo it, especially when such a long race, you cannot recover from it and you still have maybe 1,000 kilometers to go.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with the gut training side of things. Lots of people
Yeah.
kind of come to us and they do the planner and they might be doing kind of shorter, intense stuff, and it might recommend 90 grams per hour in certain situations. But it's not about just getting to the race and aiming for 90 and just trying to be able to stress your gut to tolerate that, right? It's about building this up over time. And some of the athletes that we've worked with and done these case studies and analysis for, it's taken kind of a year or two to be able to build up to where they want to be now and tolerate kind of at the upper end of those recommendations towards that 90 grams per hour for these intense races that they're doing.
And for example, I received one of your newsletter, and you were talking about caffeine consumption. So this is a really important topic, especially for ultra cycling races. You have to go most of the time through the night. I think in something like Badlands, definitely. And so, what do you see? Does it impact any other of the considerations in terms of fueling or hydration? Because caffeine is a diuretic. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that comes up a lot when we're talking about these really long extreme duration events, right? It's not so much one of those three levers that I discussed at the start, being the carbs, the sodium, and the fluid, but it's just a little extra stimulant that's got proven benefits to performance. So why not, especially if you're a user of caffeine, you're a coffee drinker day to day, try and use it to benefit during your kind of races. So there's different ways to do it, and it is a lot of it down to individual preference. If you are someone who tolerates caffeine well, there are some people who just completely hate caffeine, don't drink coffee, tea, anything like that, and then you definitely recommend staying away from it, right? But for others who are looking to use it, it's about building up a strategy of how you incorporate in the strategy, what doses do you use, and how do you time it. When we're talking about these really long durations, I have to say that the scientific literature isn't quite there. Lots of the advice is based on shorter duration events, and they don't look at over kind of 24-hour periods, and therefore the recommendations are
Yeah.
more down to kind of yourself and what you've practiced, what you can tolerate. I would say, looking at kind of our database of what athletes have been doing when we're talking about events over 12 hours, I think one of the key things is if you go too early with using caffeine and high doses, then you can get this spike, which is great, but then you get the dip. And you don't want that. So one of the key recommendations I always give for
Yeah.
these long durations is to stay away from caffeine for not always as long as you can, but for a long duration at the start of the race. So don't have it early on. Don't have it in those first few hours. Keep away from it at Badlands, for example, until it gets to like the middle of the night when you want to fight your circadian rhythm, when it's about 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and you might want to you want to keep going. You want to boost your perceived energy levels. You want to kind of avoid any dips, and then you might start using caffeine, right? You might incorporate caffeine gel here and there. Some people might use some actual kind of drinks, some caffeinated drinks, and there's different ways. That's more down to preference, not a huge difference between them. But then it's about kind of drip feeding caffeine from there. Again, not going for a massive dose and then not having any for hours and hours, and then you get the dip. It's about kind of implementing it later in the race and then drip feeding it to keep that benefit, keep the caffeine levels in your system high enough that you still get this ergogenic effect.
What doses would you think would be something in range, like
Yeah,
for using it, for example, as you mentioned, to avoid the dips during the night?
Yeah, it's tricky, like I said, as the science in terms of the literature isn't there on the recommendations, but they are. When we look at caffeine recommendations, it's all in milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So it does depend a little bit on body weight. The general guidelines are between 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram as like an overall dose. So that would be like the total amount you consume, let's say over a 24-hour period, might be 6 milligrams per kilogram. It's definitely going to be at the top end of that range if you're a caffeine user and you're going for such long durations. But how you do that is up to you. I think it's going to be once you start hitting it in kind of 50 to 100 milligram doses and then continuing that every couple of hours, right? So you might hit it. Depends on how you're doing it, whether you're using a drink, gels, tablets, people do it different ways, but that's going to be somewhere in that range of 50 to 100 as like small doses to keep yourself going, keep the levels high. And then when you add that up, that might be looking at kind of towards the 500, 600 plus milligrams total to hit that 6 milligram per kilogram recommendation of kind of caffeine over body weight.
Yeah, it's interesting also that you touch on people like it would be better not to drink caffeine before, but in ultra there's even I know a lot of people, and I do it myself, what we call caffeine diet. So I drink a lot of coffee, but before a race I stop drinking coffee 2 weeks in advance at least. So I get like then during the races I really notice it because I actually tested with Super Sapiens. I had the glucose monitor, and I noticed when I was having the dips at night, when I was feeling really low, like I was falling asleep, I actually had a huge insulin spike, and then poof, it completely collapses. So I could see exactly when I will have the dips, and then take the caffeine gel. I found it works best when you take caffeine with sugar. Caffeine by I tried caffeine tablets, but the effect was not as good as the gels. The gels kind of like the effect is quite lasts longer, I will say, than just taking caffeine by itself. And yeah, really, the caffeine diet is kind of okay. You lower the threshold for the stimulant, and then every time you take it, then during the races, the effect is higher.
Yeah, that's definitely a good way to kind of test it out and find what works for you because people kind of time it differently, dose it differently. What I'd say about kind of removing it from your diet for like a week or 2 weeks before a race, there is some proven benefits, some small benefits, and lots of our athletes do it. I would say just be cautious because obviously it can be detrimental. It can make you feel a bit worse. So I think with that kind of recommendation, it is down to preference because there's not kind of a huge added benefit that I'd recommend it to everyone. So it's about kind of down to the athlete and depending how you want to feel, right? If it's going to make a huge difference to your mood and how you feel in that final week, then it might be worth just sticking to it.
Yeah, well, I can tell you my mood wasn't good. I had like headache and I was grumpy, so but at least during the races it pays off. Yeah, that's really good. And yeah, so for example, anything that you working lately in with the team that is interesting. I know you having some developments. For example, you do that sweat test, but you also have a survey kind of on your website where you give a guideline if people want to do it.
Yeah, and it's a great place to send people. Really, it depends. Once you've got an event in mind, be that a specific one, you're going out for kind of a long ride, long session. We have an online fuel and hydration planner, and what you can do is input some individual details about you, like I said, so about your sweat rate, about your sweat sodium, and also about the event, so the duration, the distance, what you're aiming for, and then it gives you the scientific recommendations in terms of how many grams of carbohydrate should you be aiming for per hour, how much fluid roughly, and then also the sodium concentration. And then it gives some ideas as well of how you can do that, some recommendations depending on what the race is of how you might do that, bottles, what you could have in them, how much you could be having per hour, gels, chews, and different ways that you can do it. And it's just a great idea to see based on the duration and intensity of the event that you're racing for and your individual kind of hydration side of things, so your sweat losses, what the science says that you should be aiming for. And then you can really kind of test that out, build up to it. Like I said, might do some gut training to aim for kind of what the planner recommends. And you can use that as a really good basis and a guide in terms of your fueling and hydration plan.
And in terms of pre-race, like preloading on carbohydrates, I mean, we spoke about like a preloading on electrolytes and carbohydrates. What kind of meals you see your athletes tend to go for? I don't know. I think a lot of people are deviating from the pasta party lately.
Yeah, so in the kind of 1 to 2 days before an event, carb loading is obviously what everyone has discussed, what we know is beneficial, and people do that in different ways. The key is increasing the proportion of carbohydrates in your meals. You can really dig into the numbers and the scientific side of things. I say if you're looking to do that and really nail this, then we have a really good blog that details how you might do that, the numbers each day that would be advised depending on your body weight. But really, then when we're looking at kind of
Mhm.
evening and morning, it's all about the carbs. Carbohydrates are what's going to fuel you, so it's important that you're topping up your glycogen stores the night before and morning of. So in the morning, people are doing that lots of different ways, but porridge, toast, bagels, bananas, everything carb rich that you can imagine, people have had.
And what are your thoughts about fasted training? Is something that a lot of people are kind of doing right now. I do it myself, like fasted training in the morning, nothing in like intensity, but normally it's fasted, but not really because I tend to eat more in the night before, as you said, to replenish these stores. What are your thoughts about fasted training?
Yes, it's a common question around here. I'd say, in terms of, there's definitely a small place for it in your training schedule. There's definitely some early morning short sessions where you might go in fasted, you might not have time, and you might not fuel too much beforehand. I say predominantly where you want to gain the most, you want it to be race like. When you're looking to optimize your performance, you're going to want to fuel like race day. You're going to want to incorporate carbohydrates to make sure that you're going as hard and for as long as you can. That doesn't mean that every session needs to be implementing your fuel and hydration strategy as you would on race day, right? You can definitely save that for kind of the one or two key brick sessions where you're going to like fully gut train, you're going to implement the strategy, you're going to practice the hydration, and you're going to practice the fueling together. You might practice your preload as well. You might practice your pre-fuel and make sure that you've got everything nailed and really train that gut. That doesn't mean that every session needs to be as intense and using all your sports nutrition products. There's definitely a small place for some fasted sessions when we're talking about short morning sessions where you're not looking to completely optimize performance.
Yeah, I think that's a long topic. This one. Well, I'm gonna leave the links to precision fuel and hydration and all the resources we talk about in the link below. And thank you so much for joining us today, Emily.
Thanks for having me. No, it's been great.
Thanks for listening and watching. Don't forget to share the episode with your friends if you find it interesting, and also to subscribe and like on YouTube. Leave a comment if you are interested to see somebody in the podcast as a guest, or you have a certain topic that you would like to discuss. Leave a comment below. I will be racing Badlands, so I will bring you nice race updates on social media. Follow me on Instagram at cherry.cycling for live updates during the races, and stay tuned on YouTube for the upcoming race videos, including Transcontinental Race and Badlands. Until the next episode.